right, welcome everybody to the Prison Yoga Project webinar series. I'm very excited today to have our host, to be hosting Dr. Shyam Ranganathan. Let me go ahead and read off your bio here. Dr. Shyam Ranganathan, with a MA in South Asian Studies, an MA and a PhD in philosophy, is a field-changing researcher, scholar, author, and teacher of philosophy. He is an expert in the neglected traditions of Indian moral philosophy, which covers practical questions of how to live, what to aim for, and what we should value, including yoga. Dr. Ranganathan has authored, edited, or translated more than 50 scholarly works, including the books Ethics and the History of Indian Philosophy, the Bloomsbury Research and Handbook of Indian Ethics, and Hinduism, a Contemporary Philosophical Investigation. After more than 20,000 teaching hours with 3,000 students, in 2019, Dr. Ranganathan founded Yoga Philosophy, a scholar-practitioner initiative to provide anti-colonial, anti-Eurocentric, research-based knowledge. He is a member of the Department of Philosophy and the York Center for Asian Research at York University in Toronto. So
thank you.
Yeah, welcome. And I am Bill Brown. I am the executive director for Prison Yoga Project. I'm joining you today from unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation, which is now San Diego County. And this is something that I really want to encourage everybody to start to dig a little bit deeper on once you understand who was occupying the lands that you are now on. There's another layer, and start to do a little bit of research. This is something that's been actually just this morning, I was listening to a webinar that was done recently with the members of the Kumeyaay Nation talking about their resistance, which lasted well into the 1900s. And discovered that Balboa Park, if you've ever been to San Diego, was the site of a Kumeyaay village up until 1910, when it was razed to make way for Balboa Park and the Pan America Exposition that all those lovely buildings are there. So it's got some history behind it as well. So yeah, welcome.
Thank you.
Before we get started, we usually like to start with a little bit of a centering practice, and this will, I think, help us drop in to our bodies. So, and I'll go ahead and lead us in that, and then we'll jump into a conversation. Okay. So, yeah, I'm feeling very excited. I can feel this in my body, and we've been having a wonderful conversation in our little pre-webinar meeting. So I'm going to begin just by letting my eyes close. You're welcome to keep your eyes open or let your eyes close. I can feel my feet on the floor, and I can feel the energy that's moving in my torso here with my excitement. I'm starting to bring my awareness down into my feet, into my seat in the chair, and really just noticing the physical sensation of my body. So notice that your awareness sort to move into just checking in with your position, your place in time and space. And maybe noticing some of the qualities of that time and space as well. Here we have a humid day, and so I can feel the humidity in the air on my skin. And I can feel the weight of the clothing against my skin. And I'm aware of the incense, the scent of the incense that I have burning. So taking in the quality of your environment as well as an experience of your location in that environment. Dropping into that sensory experience And you might also notice in that sensory experience that thoughts may be happening. And see if you can be in relationship with those thoughts in a way that just allows them to exist in the same way the sounds or the sense or the sensation through touch might exist for you. Really stepping into an observer's position. And as you are here, noticing perhaps how your energy may be shifting. I can feel myself settling. And I'm noticing my body taking a few deeper breaths. And maybe that's something you'd like to encourage for yourself, taking in a full inhalation and letting that air fall out. So we can use some of these physical practices as a way of engaging in a conversation with our bodies. Evoking a particular response for ourselves. And in the next couple of minutes, just letting yourself rest in this awareness. And when you're ready, letting yourself return to our circle this morning. Letting your eyes come back open. Okay. Yeah, now I'm feeling a little more settled. Yeah. Well, welcome. And thanks for being here. I'm really excited. I just want to let the audience know. So I got a chance to meet Shyam at Sitar, where he gave one of the keynote addresses, which had me on the edge of my seat. It was very exciting because it's an intellectual trip that I don't get to often take with folks. And so that keynote was really, I loved it. And then it happened to be my birthday. And it was after the main banquet, and went down to the hotel bar and ran into a small group of folks. And we had a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And it was like one of the best birthday presents that I've ever had. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Like I say, most people aren't interested in philosophy or yoga at a bar, so it's a lot of fun to talk about both.
Yeah, it really was, and I'm so happy to have you here today. As we were saying earlier, in our conversation before we got started, we asked this question at the beginning of our webinars, like, what was your first experience with yoga? And I'm going to go ahead and stick with that, and we'll just see where we go from there.
Great. So I grew up with ideas of yoga in my family's background or lineage, but I didn't really understand it. Looking back, I realized there were layers of colonialism where these ideas were then kind of represented as though they would be palatable to people rooted in the Western tradition. I think it's a coping strategy that South Asians have been taking for centuries to kind of find a way to make space for themselves. But anyways, it sounded barely different from the theism that we're probably familiar with from Christianity. And it just sounded ridiculous to me. So then I went, I just didn't understand it. It was there. I didn't understand it. It was there in all the stories that I was told. I didn't understand. Then I decided to become a philosopher when I was 17, and I did an undergrad in philosophy. And I do remember I was actually quite upset at myself. I just didn't feel like I was living with the kind of integrity that I prefer to live. And so I do remember like a moment of Ishvara Pranidhana where I was like, okay, I want to be different. Devotion to Ishvara sovereignty. It was a thing I did, but like I kind of forgot about it. But like it started a ball rolling. It took a long time for me to really understand the implications of that. But anyways, I did an undergrad in philosophy. Then I went ahead and did an MA in philosophy. And I loved philosophy because philosophy was a place where you could get along with people by disagreeing. So everywhere else wanted you to conform to their way of looking at the world. But philosophy was a place like nobody expected that. But you had to learn how to interact with people without necessarily having to agree. So it was actually proto-yoga. There's a lot of yoga there. Because you're having to control what you're contemplating and then making room for yourself as an individual. Yoga Sutra book 1, 2 to 4. It's, philosophy is a lot of that. And then I went and I did very well. So I was actually a very bad student when I was a kid. I hated school. And that's probably because I was a very sick child and I never really got into it. And then finally I decided I had to pull my marks together because I needed to do something else. So I got the grades I needed. Then once I was in university, I was just like honor dean's list every semester. I just found my thing in philosophy. Then I went on and did an MA in philosophy. So this is all Western philosophy, right? That's basically what ended up being taught. And then I remember feeling like the oxygen was just disappearing because the initial openness that I found as an undergrad started disappearing in grad school. And there were weird things that happened where people would kind of appeal to intuitions and stomp on, I didn't understand how they could do that, but it was like the intuitions that white folks had, right? It was never the intuitions of people like me or looked like, but they could get away with it. And so then I was like, I needed to figure out, I didn't know what I wanted to do further with respect to research. So I said, okay, I'm going to do a degree in South Asian studies, just kind of mix things up. But it was supposed to be a 2-year degree. It turned into 5, in part because most people describe studying South Asia it's like you're dying and being reborn, because South Asia is a tradition that's nothing like the westernized world that we live in. And so for you to really start to take all that information is challenging, but I also felt really gaslit there. So one of the things I noticed is that virtually everybody who taught or wrote on South Asia was not qualified to do so. They would all want to write on philosophy, but none of them were actually trained in philosophy. They were linguists or philologists or historians. And the thing I got interested in was this idea that South Asians had no interest in moral or political philosophy. So the story in the academy was that South Asians were interested in every abstract idea except for how to live, which is ridiculous. If you know a South Asian, they were obsessed with these kinds of questions about this is a tradition that came up with the idea of karma. How do you not care about? But this was just the view. And so I was like, well, why is it that everybody here is so ridiculous? This is across the board. And it took me a while. First, I noticed that what people would do is that they would assume a Western perspective and think that if South Asians had anything to say about moral political issues, it had to agree with the kinds of things that they would learn from Plato, Aristotle, or Kant, which is crazy because these were different people. Why would you expect that? But it was also just this idea that South Asians couldn't disagree. They couldn't have a different view on how to live. It had to be filtered through the European tradition. So it was basically academic colonialism. It still goes on. I'm one of the very few people who kind of writes and talks about this. So then I got tired of South Asian studies because I figured it was even worse. I was leaving philosophy because I felt like there was less room for me, but it's even worse here. And so I started a PhD in philosophy, and I was interested in translation. And people think that's a geeky topic, but really it's important because translation is about how you understand people who are not like you, right? So you don't share a language or a culture, you're historically disconnected, right? How do you understand them? And I did this kind of in Western philosophy and contemporary Western philosophy, basically the Anglo-American tradition called the analytic tradition, but I also drew from continental sources. And I started noticing some weird things. First of all, I could explain what I saw in South Asian studies as an entailment of like these ordinary views that people in the Western tradition had about thought. They basically, from the start, think about thought in terms of like what you would say in your language and culture, right? And it was very interesting to then look back on the study of South Asia as something dominated by linguists. I'm like, oh, that's exactly what you would do if you were really part of the Western tradition. You would think it's really just all about language. And then I started noticing the difficulty the Western tradition had with philosophy. It's the only tradition that begins with the murder of a philosopher. Like in South Asia, philosophers were revered, right? And you could just be counterculture and people thought that was cool, right? You could leave society like the Buddha or Mahavira and then do your own thing, and then people would revere you. But Socrates is murdered for not conforming to social expectations, right? The charges were he's corrupting the youth and promoting false gods, but that just means he wasn't living up to social expectations. But, if you understand that the West is based on this idea of like, well, thinking is about what you would say, it's all about social conformity, because what you would say has to do with your language, and that's something you share in a culture, and you learn that by being raised in the culture. So being a good person is about fitting in. You see this in Plato and Aristotle. So anyways, while I was working on translation, the question of like, how would you do it? And I came up with a story, a general story, and then a specific story, depending on the kind of subject you're interested in. I took on the challenge of translating the Yoga Sutra, because I was asked to teach the Yoga Sutra to an Ayurveda school, and I couldn't stand any of the translations. And so I had enough Sanskrit, and I was working on translation. And sorry for the long-winded answer. I'm getting to
No. It's great. It's great.
So I started translating the Yoga Sutra, and two things happened. First, the Yoga Sutra started teaching me about this problem that I had, which was like this technical problem. It's like, how do we understand people who are not like that? How can we get along with diversity and kind of still and be individuals, like without expecting others to conform to us? It was just amazing. Now, I didn't understand the Yoga Sutra as well then as I do now, but I understood enough to realize that it had solutions to a lot of these kinds of technical problems. And then year after year, I would kind of come back to Yoga Sutra. I had some great supportive colleagues who said, start teaching that, include that in your standard philosophy courses, right? And so I would, and two things would happen. I noticed that students really connect, like students were able to connect with it in ways that they weren't when I taught Descartes or something else. But I found year after year, I was going back to the Yoga Sutra to answer, to deal with all, until one day I'm like, oh, I guess this is just my thing. I guess I'm practicing yoga as taught by Patanjali. So my way to yoga wasn't like I might have gone to 5 asana classes or something. It's not really, I did it a really weird way. I just started translating the Yoga Sutra. But then, it just opened up a huge research project, because then I started appreciating the ways in which colonialism, Western colonialism dominates even the academic discourse in yoga studies. It's like really bad. And Indology, where the Western tradition is assumed as a kind of frame for the study of everything else. And people even believe myths made up by the Western tradition, like the idea of religion. It was the Romans that made that up. And they made that up as colonizers, as a way to deal with traditions that they were willing to tolerate, but in a subservient position, right? The early Christians weren't recognized as having religion, and they were persecuted, and so they had to make the case that they were a different kind of Jew, because Jews had. So it's just so messed up, and so people take these ideas really seriously, when meanwhile they're just creations of colonialism. Of course, when the British come to South Asia, they decide there has to be an indigenous religion that is in Islam, and they use the Persian word Hindu to talk about the entire tradition. So anyways, two things happened. First, I started to appreciate the ways in which there's this colonizing tradition that just ends up being kind of the standard, what people think of as just the way things are. But what yoga allowed me to do is appreciate that there's a history to that, right? It came about in time. It's like basically a samskara, a tendency, impression that people take on passively, that undermines our autonomy, our individual freedom. And then correlatively, I started kind of doing a lot more work on Indian ethics. And one of the outcomes of this work was appreciating that yoga is actually a fourth basic ethical theory, in addition to the one we're familiar with in the West, virtue ethics, consequentialism, and deontology. So it all just kind of blew up. But really, for me, it's yoga. Yoga is really what provided me the skills and support to peel away my own colonization, and to think historically that, and not simply just reapply things I'm used to, right? So like, now we believe that there's such a thing as Hinduism, but there was a time when South Asians wouldn't have known what you were talking about, right? And normally when we're not practicing yoga, we just treat our experiences as though they're like facts. And then we use that to explain everything without appreciating that, well, there were choices involved in these ideas, right? And we don't necessarily have to, we could choose something else that's better for us.
Yeah. Yeah. You said something in there about that, like from a Western perspective, that being a good person is about fitting in.
Yeah.
That I think is really key here. And I'm getting shades or tones of this idea that there's this macro colonization that happens, where Western ways of understanding something are projected onto whatever the Western mind encounters, right?
Right.
And that this happens at a macro level, and it also happens internally at our own personal level. And that in a lot of ways, when we're talking about yoga and the, philosophy of yoga, it's almost like the antidote to that turning. Can you talk? And I know that you use this term, that yoga as a devotion to sovereignty. And so this idea of fitting in and sovereignty.
Yeah.
Something that they don't always run together, right?
Right, for sure.
Unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I'd love to. So Yoga Sutra, book 1, sutras 1 to 4, right? Really important, where we get this contrast between two approaches to the data, right? We can either take responsibility to organize and delineate the options, and that allows us our individual freedom to choose and assess. Right? So that's the Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. That's the organization into kind of discrete options. And then so then the seer can abide in its essence. So then you as an individual can be free to know, or you just kind of buy what you experience. Right? And that's the anti-yoga option. Now, the Western, so one of the ways that I think, the way to really appreciate what's going on is to distinguish between thinking and believing. And the Western tradition conflates these two. So a thought is something that can be true or false, and it has inferential implications, right? So like the thought it's raining outside, if true, entails that water's falling from the sky. But I can have the belief that water's falling from the sky, and that's me endorsing that thought. Nothing follows from my believing it. Right? Because that's just a funny psychological fact about me. What we find at the start of the Yoga Sutra is the distinction between thinking and engaging in propositional attitudes like belief, fear, hope. There are all sorts of anger. You could be angry that, right? There are all sorts of ways we can passively relate to thoughts. But then we've changed the subject from what we're thinking about to ourselves. But we don't appreciate that. We still think it's the thing, right? Like, I could be angry that it's raining outside. And I think it's about the rain, but really it's about me. It's about my psychology. And when we practice yoga, we appreciate that that's not actually a responsible way to deal with what you can contemplate via attitudes. So we take responsibility to organize, think, and that gives us our personal freedom. The Western tradition begins with what I call the West. It's not, so when we talk about the West, right, it's a geography, and I think it's very colonial to think that we mean Europe, because Africa's in the West, and First Nations people in North and South America, they're in the West too. So I use a capital W slanted that leans on the East to talk about a specific colonizing tradition that goes back to the ancient Greeks. And they had this one word for thought, reason, speech, logos. So this idea conflates what you can say with what you can think. Now, the thing is, when we speak, we articulate typically what we believe, or to assert a thought, when we assert a thought, we're communicating what we believe. So this model of thought conflates thinking and believing. So it's an anti-yoga model of thought from the start. And because it conflates thinking and believing, it promotes the idea that acceptable thinking is about buying what we believe, or at least what I believe. But where am I getting my beliefs from? If they're linguistic, it's from my culture. I could be idiosyncratic about it, but then notice the anxiety I'm going to get, right? Nobody's going to share my belief. So this encourages groupthink, this model. And you can see it in Plato and Aristotle. Like, you just go and read them, right? They Book 10, the Republic, Plato dreams up this isolated society, and at the end he's like, we can't allow outsiders in. Now Plato's not very serious. He's conducting a thought experiment, but he's following to the end the logical implications of that. And Aristotle, he doesn't talk about outsiders, but he does talk about some people who are naturally born slaves. But you only became a slave, or you typically became a slave by conquest, right? So the people who would be slaves were outsiders. So this model sets up this idea of an in-group, and sharing that perspective is about what it is to be credible, and then it problematizes people on the outside. And so it's not a mystery that this becomes a global colonizing tradition, because it has no way to deal with anybody except by swallowing them within their cultural perspective, right? So century after century, and the earliest examples of colonialism is the invention of the idea of religion to deal with BIPOC traditions, and then it evolves. Like Constantine decides that there will be an official religion, right? And people get confused because then they think that, well, religion is somehow the official position. It's actually, it's always been something from outside of the Western tradition. But it doesn't mean that it can't be used for colonial purposes. At any rate, the whole world has been colonized by this. You can't go any place where people don't believe in these kinds of things like religion, or, the fact that we can speak English almost everywhere, or French,
right?
That just didn't happen. It's just the whole world has been swallowed by this tradition.
It's amazing how powerful it is. Yeah. And also, it really strikes me as how brittle as well, because then the minute you start to encounter things that don't reinforce your belief,
right,
or things that don't conform to what your expectations are, it's a threat.
For sure. So I think Book 2, Sutra 3, right? So there's an account of kleshas, the afflictions, and they arise first from ignorance, the ignorance of just buying your experiences, and then that leads to asmita egotism, which is a sense of self based on the contingencies of your life. And then that leads to either a sense of relief when things are in conformity to your ego, or a sense of anxiety when they're out of pace with it. But either way, you're stuck in klesha and affliction.
Yeah.
And so, Asmita egotism is this very fragile. So white fragility is just like an example of it, but it's an example of, because when you operate according to ego, you don't have healthy boundaries, right? You've gotten rid of healthy boundaries because you've identified with your experiences. And so then now you become like part of the Borg, basically. Like you're there defending your experiences, whether they were good or bad for you, right? You become an agent of the system. And the reason you become an agent of the system is because you get alarmed when anything is out of place with those expectations, right? And so that's why things are so difficult to change. People, for the most part, aren't operating autonomously. They're operating as a function of their experiences.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And so and it's this process. I mean, I guess I would be interested to hear how you like, what is the practice of yoga then, as a practice?
So one of the things that I learned as I was kind of thinking about methodology and I talk about this a lot, like we just have to use the basics of logic. When we can think logically, we're not interested in what's true, we're just interested in what follows. That's basically an application of yoga. But one of the things that I've learned from this is that people often just exactly say what they mean. So it's all there in the Yoga Sutra. It's totally naked, right? And a lot of time people think it's really mysterious, but it's like, well, on kind of high level, yoga is this responsible ordering of what you can contemplate in order to allow your own individuality, right? And that's what we might call the meta-ethics. Meta-ethics is a technical term for like what's involved in understanding what the practical options are. So that's in book one. Book two begins with the definition of yoga as a kriya, as an activity. So then what does it look like for you to engage in that? Well, it's basically devotion to Ishvara, sovereignty. And Ishvara has two different sides. It's not stuck in its past, free to move forward. So as we are devoted to Ishvara, we practice these essential traits of tapa, self-challenge, being unconservative, and swadhyaya, self-determining ourselves according to our own values, right? So it's there. It's really that simple. But I do think that the reason people miss this is there's an allergy to Ishvara. There's an allergy to the idea of devotion. Maybe it strikes them, it sounds too much like what they learned from theistic religions. But also, I think this partially is ego. People are scared to move past what they're familiar with. And devotion to Ishvara is all about that, right? So you have to, to be devoted to Ishvara is to be willing to move past your past experiences. It is about really owning choices as opposed to simply being programmed by experiences. And I think a lot of people, that sounds frightening in and of itself. But I mean, really, the alternative is even worse. So I think, I had this allergy, like growing up, I thought it was just, it sounded like I was giving up something like my freedom until I realized, no, it's just the opposite. I'm actually working on being an individual, but I have to get over my ego.
I wonder, if this is actually, part of the human experience of, being born helpless and needing so much of that support, and then needing to conform in order to maybe ensure your place in the world, but then moving past that.
Well, I know in my own trauma, like my own kleshas, I remember thinking I could just do what I want, but boy, I'm going to be alone, right? And so I'm going to have to find a way to put up with these people. This and that. But I think when we look at the South Asian tradition, they knew that there was a time for that, and then there was a time to get over it, right? So yeah, for sure, when you're small, you have to accept the help of other people, and you should also be grateful for that help as far as you get it. But it's not forever. At some point, you have to leave that, and then you have to find a way to be your own person, right? You're not a student forever. You're not a child forever. And, the yoga, if it wasn't, yoga is kind of operates at a very deep level as a kind of very basic practice. And then people would choose different things. And so they might decide to become Buddhist or Jains or something, but that, whatever they're doing it, yoga ends up being in the background, because why are you doing it? You're doing it to get over your problems, to really, own your own choices. And so, I also didn't understand that in the tradition. I would hear these things that people, the yoga tradition, well, everybody's really doing this, even though they don't appreciate it. But I see, because if you're making your own choices and you're deciding to, make a change, you're doing it in some way. So I feel like they appreciated the importance of this, but because the Western tradition is basically an anti-yoga tradition, it's about conformity all the way, right? And education is really just about showing that you've mastered the propaganda, right? So then they will promote you to a higher level or something like that. And I see this in yoga organizing, these pyramid schemes with the enlightened guru at the top, and people are trying their education means learning what yoga is according to the master. That's Plato. It's not yoga. Plato's Republic. But I think when people from the Western tradition want to learn, right, they use these models that are familiar, that part of their samskaras, their ancient samskaras, and so then they just duplicate it. But I think it's just amazing to think, well, there were people who didn't have these. They had different problems, or they didn't have this problem, right? And they could see, you have to get over this conformity thing at some point.
Yeah. And that this is, and I think too, this is something that and yet we also still exist with each other and in relationship to each other.
Right.
And so this individual devotion to sovereignty, there is also another side to that.
Right.
In that relationship, that everyone has the right to this, to be individual and sovereign, and should have the opportunity for the space for that. Right.
Well, because when you're devoted, so Ishvara isn't. So this is really important. Ishvara can't be you. It's aspirational. It's something different. And then the reason that's important is that that's what you need in order to move past your ego. Because if it was just you, it would just be your ego. So Ishvara, you have to take Ishvara seriously as an ideal. But then it's not proprietary, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it's that moment when you appreciate this is not a proprietary ideal, that this is what it is to be a person. To be a person is to have an interest in this. Then you have a sense of solidarity with other people, right? But people are anything that has anything that can thrive given their own unconservatism and self-governance. And that's why in the yoga tradition, it's never been speciesist. It's never just been about humans. The earth is a person, anything that's given this freedom, right? And so you have this kind of instant insight into the challenges of what it is to be a person. And then you're not fussed that people look different than you or sound different. Like none of that matters, right? We all have our own past, but we all share this common interest. And so, very quickly you get this sense of solidarity with others. But you also appreciate that a lot of people make bad choices on purpose. I think that's also something you come to appreciate, that, people make bad choices, but they're choosing. And so the solidarity becomes complicated because you're having to kind of maintain this insight while appreciating that people are squandering their, in a way that's inconvenient to everybody else, and problematic for everyone else, their sovereignty, their opportunity for being sovereign.
Yeah. Yeah. In a way that's harmful to others.
Yeah. So like this was explored, like in the Bhagavad Gita. That's what, if you look at those kinds of explorations of yoga, there is this insight that at some point, right, like you might want to be as accommodating and friendly as possible. It doesn't mean that everybody else is going to make that same choice. And you do have to take a stand. And it does sometimes involve a fight. So yoga, the people in this tradition were never kind of weirdly delusional about what being committed to practice means. It's like when you are committed, when you are practicing yoga, you are creating an environment for people, and so you're paying it forward in a way, and then hopefully other people in your environment being affected by your choices, right? That you are showing them a way that they too can also live, that they take the opportunity to start paying that forward too. And we were talking about learning or teaching, right? Like good teaching is about creating an environment where people can learn. It's not about programming. It's not about downloading the instructions, right? And so, in a way, the activism in the yamas, it's already there in the yamas, is about creating that environment where others have that opportunity too, right? But that's just generated by our own practice.
Yeah. That by, so if the colonial trip is to project our beliefs out and to try and get the world to conform to what our expectations are, then if we are practicing this responsibility, being responsibility with the data. I love that phrase, and then we begin to move past the fragility that causes us to lay our trip on other people, and we can make space for others for us to coexist in a way that's mutually supportive.
Right. Yeah. So, how is a healthy relationship possible? It's possible between people who have healthy boundaries, right? So in order to get good relationships off the ground, we each have to have these healthy boundaries, but these healthy boundaries are a function of us being responsible and practicing ourselves. And so really, it's not possible any other way. Like and one of the things that kind of drives me nuts in yoga land is all this talk of community. Community is not a basic idea in yoga. Personal relations are, right? But that's not the same as community, right? So yoga helps us understand how each relationship is a unique thing between individuals, right? Community is like this generic thing. I can be in a community, but like, that doesn't mean that I have a special relationship with everybody. We're just all part of the same group. But like when I'm practicing, I'm actually creating a unique relationship with every other person on the basis of a shared interest in being persons. And, in that form, that can form social, like a whole social scene, right? But it also allows us to be individuals, to make quirky choices that are, totally consistent with this practice, right? We don't have to all kind of share a vision or something like that. So there's this kind of radically decentering impact of yoga. And that's what we need to live healthy lives. So yeah. So I mean, it is just kind of there's so many ways that people just interpret. So what I call, this is, I didn't make this up. This is just what called in the literature when you try and explain things in terms of your beliefs. So, often when people interpret the Yoga Sutra, they'll see like kaivalya, the kind of the outcome as an isolation, right? They don't think autonomy, independence. They think isolation, social isolation. And then they'll also, if they want to put a positive spin, they'll want to stress community, etc. But communities can be good or they can be bad. There's no magic to them, right? And it's up to us to create the right kinds of communities. But that means that it's person-to-person relationships that really kind of form the bedrock for that. So
I'm thinking about what happens inside prisons and jails, and I'm thinking about the men, the people in my group in Donovan State Prison, and the difference between the way our yoga group is with one another and the other types of communities that exist within prisons, where you might have racial affinity groups or gang affinities, and there are power structures within that,
right,
that are, this is to me one of the places of one of the seeds of harm in our world, is that taking power over another individual. And something that we stress in the groups is when we get gathered to practice asana, we sit in a circle, because there's no hierarchy in that circle. Now, I may have a functional role as being the one to kind of shape the experience, but I'm also trying to do that in a way that doesn't tell people what to do or what to experience, but then just drawing their awareness into whatever it is that they're experiencing in a way that experience itself can become the thing that they, that's their teacher. That's
right. Right. So this is great, right? Like, so we do have roles as teachers, but really that we're facilitators, right? If we're a good teacher, we're facilitators. Learning is like eating. Everybody's got to do it themselves. There's no way to do it by proxy. So, and you're right that in order to get like community off the ground, there is almost always a hierarchy, because someone's got to determine what the shared values are, right? And otherwise, it just becomes a bunch of people. And so, I'm not surprised that community was not a basic idea in yoga, because yoga is about this kind of radical individuality, right, of us as people, as the foundation of our relationships with others. And
I'm curious about the yamas and niyamas in that. Then, things that we want to restrain, things that we want to encourage. These do seem to be addressing. Well, I guess I maybe even to open this up a little bit more, like the parts of the Yoga Sutras that do address interpersonal relationship. If this is a very internal process that we're going through, but we're also going through it in relationship to an environment, and part of that environment is other human beings as well, and other non-human beings as well. And so there are aspects of the Yoga Sutras that guide us in that relationship. Yeah.
Right. So the limbs are upayas, they're remedies, right? So they're there for the support of the practice. So we always have to know what the core practice is. So we can go back to the start of book 2, where it's this Ishvara Pranidhana, and you do that by practicing your tapas and svadhyaya. But like, to help, here are some limbs. Now, the first limb is a Mahavrata, a universal obligation everybody's supposed to do, Patanjali says. But, that's an anti-colonial political starting point, which is you disrupt the harm and then allow the social facts of Satya, the ahimsa that allows the Satya, that reveals, right, people not being deprived of what they need, asteya, personal boundaries respected, brahmacharya, no one's hoarding, right? So this ends up being, and then, potentially says all sorts of interesting things. Like when you see people who advocate violence, you need to have the insight that this is preceded by trauma. And that if you don't have the insight that the advocacy for violence is based on trauma, you're not going to be able to stop it. How do you stop it? You stop it by interrupting it, by being the opposite, right? So by being not someone who's based on trauma, but ahimsa. And then that has the effect of getting others to renounce their hostility, right? So Gandhi based his whole political movement, the idea of direct action in Gandhi's form was based on the Yoga Sutra. He credits potentially with the position. Of course, Martin Luther King follows Gandhi's examples, credits him with kind of showing how it's done. He re-understands it in a Christian way, but he says that Gandhi's the first one to show that it can be done. So what's interesting about this is that it's about disruption. It's not about cohesion, right? So when you look at the way the yamas work, is you are disrupting social relations that are pathological. And what you're doing then is you're allowing people to be individuals. And so even it's not community, right? It's like, how did the civil rights movement work? It wasn't about being a good member of community. It was about recognizing that community was the ground of oppression for Black people, and that those communal expectations had to be challenged and disrupted. So, even there, when I look at the Yoga Sutra, I'm like, it's pretty disruptive. But I think we just have to get rid of it's very Western. We have to get rid of this idea that like good social relations is about communal relations, right? The responsible relations are person to person. And so what we're doing then when we're practicing is we're creating a social environment where people are given the opportunity to be an individual. And that involves a lot of unlearning. It involves a lot of giving up of baggage and some scars and the whole bit.
Yeah. It amazes me how, this is something that really has been emerging for us, I think, and maybe I'm speaking for us. I'll speak for myself. This has really been emerging for myself, that understanding of really making space for individual rather than, and then how far can we expand our notion of what is, I can't get out of the language around it. What's acceptable.
Right.
I can't even get past the.
So that's okay. There are still standards, right? But they're yogic standards. So then we got to specify what are those standards. And what is important is that the standards as upayas are there to support what's really not about standards, but about personal devotion, right? So you have at the core of the practice is your devotion to Ishvara, and you practice that by your tapas and swadhyaya. But then as a support, you say, look, there are some non-negotiable standards, like we are going to, start off with, like, yamas is just how we show up. Now, that isn't a compromise because, in a way, when potentially specifying the lenses, you should already be doing this just as a matter of it should just be an outcome of your devotion. If you didn't realize that that's part of it, here's number one. But it ultimately goes down, like the core of this is this personal practice, right? So it's okay to talk about standards as long as we know that those are like training wheels or something like that.
So I love that these standards should be an outcome of your practice, but we're just going to go ahead and get them out of the way first. And I think that this is something that I've been, playing with for about the last year or something that, okay, the yamas and niyamas start with ahimsa, right? Non-harming. And I think that this is an acknowledgement that this is something that human beings are maybe apt to engage in harming and that this is something that, to me, when I look at our evolution, our biology, we have this brainstem, this limbic system that's about self-preservation, and that really is about taking a physical action and not really using our ability to make a choice, but behaving instinctually or habitually, and that oftentimes that is going to cause harm. And so this is why this is something that we need to restrain, and that making that choice is really about taking like conscious control of our evolution. That this is in some ways, I think the Yoga Sutras is like a manual for conscious evolution rather than just habitual, reactive, regressive behavior.
Right. So there are two competing explanatory principles. There's Prakriti, nature, and then there's Purusha, person. So if you want to look at the history, right, at the very start of the Vedic period, people just thought that the world was governed by natural forces, and they had to do these sacrifices to please them in order to survive. And then they realized that it didn't really work. And then they did this flip where they said, okay, well, we have to understand ourselves as individuals, and our substance, Atma, our substance is growth, expansion, and development. And this is what Brahman, and this is what we share with many living things, right? Yoga takes this contrast between the earlier kind of outside view of nature and the inside and says, look, this is a choice, right? You could decide, but that means it was always a choice. There was always a choice, but so why do we think that things worked before? So, Darwin's mechanism of natural selection is not about individual thriving. It's just about species passing along genes that survive, right? So as long as the baby lived long enough to have a baby, and that baby lived long, that's all it takes. So whatever was naturally selected was probably not really in our interests as individuals to begin with. It was just like a kind of blind process, a kind of mindless, unintentional process of passing along genes. So as a yogi, I'm like, oh, that's the way Prakriti works, right? So Prakriti has these patterns, and it's regulated according to its own rules. But as an individual, as a person, there's something else that's something more important than that, which is the explanation of my life from the inside, not from the outside, right? So and so that's kind of, we always have the option of just deciding that evolution knows what it's doing, but that's just wrong. Right? It only ever solved for that one weird problem of passing on genes long enough for the baby to pass along the genes, right? So, and I think that's why in the yoga tradition, they just always thought that this is something that this is a choice people have to make. And when they make it, and it's not about species, it's a choice that people have to make. And when they make it, the sign is that they're able to have personal relationships, right? So it's not about just being forced to, like, you actually have a relationship with another individual and you can be supportive of them. And, our evolutionary history also shows that we just didn't show up out of the blue. Like, our ape ancestors also had friends and and stuff like that. So, but it's just always the thing we have to. And in a way, Yoga Sutra Book 1, Sutras 1 to 4, when you have the two options of like you can be responsible or you just buy it. That's a contrast between nature, which is you just buy it, and the personal choice. And I think the reason why it's a choice is that it's never easy, but it's always, it's better. Like, in a way, it's easier not to work. You just end up being forced into things. That's why tapas is so important. Like, you gotta really work it.
Yeah. I'm noticing the time, and I want to. We're gonna open it up for some questions and answers first, but or not first, but hang on one second. But first, I guess I want to ask: is there before we move into that, is there something that we haven't talked about today that you want to make sure that we get into?
I just want to address the title of the song that we talked about. So just to kind of be really clear about colonial trauma and Western fragility, I think like we've said enough to explain how the trauma comes. The trauma comes around because people are simply buying their experiences. And there is a history of this. They're just operating according to their beliefs. And there is a history of this way of understanding based on this very ancient Western model of thought, is what you say. So it would be surprising if people raised and embracing the Western tradition didn't have this kind of fragility. The fragility that comes about by trying to understand everything in terms of what they would say. I think the sign of this in yoga land and yoga studies, the fact that people aren't really interested in studying philosophy. Like even in yoga studies, they think that you could be a linguist and study texts, or, if you know Sanskrit, then like, this idea that this basic activity of understanding what the options are to allow our individual, that's what we do in philosophy, right? That's so an essential to yoga, right? That I think is such a remarkable sign of this fragility, that people can't even tolerate the idea that like, oh, look, there are options, right? And I should understand what they are. Yoga being just one of them, right? And so when people don't want to learn philosophy, then yoga becomes whatever they want it to be. And so it's just a word. And then people talk about, oh, yoga means a lot of different things to people. I mean,
sure.
Yeah, like, okay. So what? Like, as a philosopher, I'm like, sure, people might have all sorts of beliefs something, but why should any of us care? But that's kind of where we are in a lot of yoga studies and yoga land, but it's just so Western to not think philosophy is important.
Yeah.
Because why? Philosophy upsets social conformity. That's why people don't like it. It upsets their ego. So anyways, I'm very glad to be in the presence of this company where philosophy is valued. But I think that would be kind of the main sign of this Western fragility.
Yeah. I've gotten instructions from Priscilla on how to unlock from the drop down. All right, there's an option so that we can open this up for folks. There is an option you might see in the chat drop down. Chat drop down.
So Dolores Doe Macias asked a question.
Oh, great.
I would just respond to that.
Great. Perfect.
Thank
you so much
for taking the time to share with us. My quick question is there a particular published translation of the Yoga Sutras that potentially that you would recommend? My translation. Only because I translated it because I couldn't stand any of the other translations. I'm still learning. So there's small things I would do a little different. Yeah, there we go. But I still feel, because I decided when I was translating it, I wasn't going to try to understand it in terms of like how I saw the world. I feel like I allowed myself to learn from it. I was kind of, what really made it possible in the way is like, I was this like post-punk goth kid from Toronto who just I couldn't tolerate it. I couldn't stand the propaganda. So I was just really happy to learn philosophy from someone who wasn't from around here. And anyways, just a sutra. There are two challenges to sutra trust. First of all, a sutra is like a zip file. So you take a lot of ideas and you compress it, and each word has many meanings. And what most people do is they decide which meaning they like and they ignore the rest. That's to defeat the purpose. You got to blow them all up, look at all the meanings for every sutra, and then try to understand what complicated argument is being expressed in all of that, which no one else oddly did. They would just decide this is the meaning that's relevant and that one isn't. Which is so. Anyways, that's why I recommend my translation.
Yeah, and I think if we should have the chat open. Priscilla, if you can just grab a link that maybe and drop that into the
Blair did. I can well, if you can get this, so here I'll just put the publication details in.
Okay, cool. Yep.
Yeah, and you can get this at there are inexpensive Kindle versions on Amazon. On my website, if you want, unfortunately, I'm not on Amazon, so shipping's expensive, but I can send you a signed copy. So if you go to you can also get one from me if you're in North America.
So, as I was reading through it this morning, and I was really kind of appreciating the Vritti. You have layers in Vritti that I've never seen in any other translation of the Yoga Sutras that completely change my understanding in relation to it in a way that is going to take a bit to sink in. And this is something that even, and I'm just kind of because it is one of the so foundational, right? It's Chitas Vritti Nirodha.
Right.
Can you maybe just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. What I did was for every word, I went to the Moni Sanskrit, English Sanskrit dictionary, which is the most comprehensive Sanskrit English dictionary. And I would drop in the word, but not assume that and then I would look at the main, you find lots of meanings, but then there would be kind of top level meanings. And I would take them as what was included, because the whole point of a sutra text wasn't to just have a single idea, to have many ideas compressed into one, and then you would have to blow it up.
Mm-hmm.
And so that made the text memorizable, so people could memorize it. But then the understanding was always in the blowing up. And so one of the meanings of Vritti is actually ethical behavior. And everybody else just ignored that. But it's there. If you pop it in the dictionary, it shows up. Most people translate the Yoga Sutra on the basis of a commentary by Vyasa. And Vyasa was very influenced by a contrary school, Sankhya. The Sankhya also thinks that the universe evolves by Prakriti and that we are individuals. But on the Sankhya view, we have no input into what goes on. It's just all nature. We're just observers. And yoga begins by saying, look, you have a choice. You can believe every story you hear, organize the options, right? It begins with choice. And so there's no way to ignore activity as an essential part of what it is to be a person on the yoga account without just ignoring what it has to say. So, the fact that it begins on this active point, and then it's using this word, vritti, that has these moral layers to it, led me to think that really a way or a useful way to think about translating yoga's chitta vritti nirodha is yoga is the control of the moral character of thought. So it's about controlling how your thoughts respect you, right? And then how it can respect others too. And then when you do that, then you can abide, then the seer can abide in itself. Then you can be independent. And people thought that was weird. I'm like, it's just go look at the dictionary. I was like, am I the only guy who went and looked at the dictionary? Yeah, I am. Because what people would do is they would read Vyasa, who's got this kind of non-agential view of the individual, or they bring all their assumptions about how yoga is this esoteric text about running away or something. And then they would just choose and filter what they wanted to see. Yeah.
I wonder, is that other perspective, because there's this idea that we're going to move past our physical body, or that somehow the physical body and our physical presence is defiled and that we need to cleanse.
Plato. People, this is one of the problems of not understanding the history of Plato. That's from Plato. It doesn't say that in Yoga Sutra. it doesn't say that in any classical stuff that the body is, well, no, Buddhists later on do have this kind of view of the body as something you should meditate on as like depressed, but that's not yoga.
Yeah.
It's just not part of the yoga. You need your body. How else are you going to do anything? Right?
Yeah.
You have to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
Plato says that the body is the prison of the soul, and the death is a kind of blessing where you're, where there are different souls, and some have to kind of are bound to repeat certain things, but like, that's a kind of blessing. It's a weird idea in yoga. Nobody, like, good thing you died. Who would have said such a thing? Right? So yeah, I think that's just also part of this Western colonialism, that people bring these very Western ideas to yoga.
We've got a couple of questions. Joanne is saying, what hope is there to change the way we indoctrinate our kids to conform? How do we plant the seed? And this is actually something that I was thinking earlier too. When I was mentioning, it seems like we come into this world helpless, and we need this support, and so we're going to behave in ways that ensure the continuity of that support. And I wonder if there are ways that we can be with our kids that support that sovereignty more so.
Yeah. Well, I do think taking a more South Asian approach is the right. You think about raising a person as raising an individual who has to be responsible for themselves. And so what you do is you then start teaching them from a very early age things like Ishvara Pranidhana, things like, what it is to be a person, the solidarity we have with other people, right? And so you start opening up compassion and a concern for others, but also you start raising an individual, right? So teaching does not have to be propaganda.
Yeah.
Right. So I think we just have to think about this in terms of what would be a good pedagogical strategy, right? You want to create an environment where your child learns. And that's different from just operating under fear that if they don't do what you expect, they'll be upset, right? It's a very different, it's a model where there are risks and they'll have to take chances, but, calculated and within, as they get older, more and more risks. But, it's like learning to swim. If you learn how to swim, you're like unlikely to drown, right? But if you don't learn how to swim because you're scared of the water or something, you'll probably drown. So I think about, that's kind of the yogic thing to do. So in this respect, I think it is useful to think about these stories and ideas from the South Asian tradition, where yoga was a really big part of, where the idea, and it's so easy to turn this into some weird kind of propaganda about believing in God or something, but the ideas are almost always about what work an individual does themselves to overcome their challenges, right? And that devotion is about you taking on that responsibility to do the work yourself.
Yeah. And this is really landing with me is just so powerful in terms of, if we're going to be here and we're going to get along and we're going to coexist and survive as a species and as a planet, there's this force for conformity, that this is the right way to do things. This is the only way to do things. And that there is another way of getting to that cooperation, and it's through radical individuality. And that this is the path that yoga puts us on, that when we're practicing yoga, we're on that path to a different way. It's instead of and this is, when I relate this to punitive versus a restorative approach to justice, it's like, well, I'm going to be an external force and I'm going to get you to behave in a particular way by offering you carrots and sticks,
right?
Not by giving you space to develop your own moral character, which is what I think, a restorative justice, taking responsibility for the harms, recognizing the ways in which we've been harmed that shape our behaviors, then the ways that we interact with the world, and everything, the interpersonal trauma, the systemic traumas and oppressions that we face, and all of that contributes into that, and then developing an internal sense for guidance, rather than that external.
Yeah, absolutely. In a lot of yoga derived traditions, Ishvara is our higher self or inner controller, but that means it's not something that comes and forces us from the outside. It's something that informs us, from the inside. So when we do devotionally, we're doing it because we're doing it freely. And that's the best kind of person I have around. Not someone who's just worried about following the rules. So they won't know what to do when the rules won't. When the rules are no longer useful. Right? They're a complete loss.
Yeah, we've got another question from Tamison. Can you speak to ways of repairing harm and conflict between groups when conformity is not the goal of conflict resolution, i.e., we are not asking that one group moves to being like the other group? So I think that's a really, really fascinating question.
Yeah. So just as long as you're not expecting everybody to do one thing, right? So I think, part of I think what keeps the animosity going is this sense of self as someone wrong. It's one thing to appreciate that you've been wronged. It's another thing to have a sense of self, an ego based on that harm. And I see this a lot. I see this with people who are BIPOC folks who have traumatic racialized experiences, but then instead of being critical of that political structure that tries to force them into that racialized mold, they understand themselves in terms of those racial roles and then get angry at people who have different racialized roles, right? So, and the reason why this goes on is that people aren't wrong for noticing that they've been harmed, but they are harming themselves by forming an identity around that harm. So I think if you can encourage people to give up their egotism, right, all of a sudden you're gonna start having individuals. It's not gonna be groups of people, really. You're gonna have individuals relating to each other, right? And then they can start to form real relationships with each other of various degrees of intensity. But it's that is kind of the decolonial. That is the yoga step, and what most people. I think a lot of people don't want to do that because they want to somehow profit from their place in an unequal system. They want to feel like, well, at least in this context, it should be an advantage to me to understand myself as someone who's got this role in life, right? At least in this, and those people, they just end up melting. Because they're not allowing themselves to be resilient, to grow in any way. So I think that would be it. Like anytime you're having some kind of call, can you encourage people to come to a place where they're not ego-based? And then and that allows them also to acknowledge that they have been harmed and that it was wrong. So one of the things that I convey in kind of trauma yoga context is that what yoga allows us to realize is that while what happened to me was wrong, I'm not wrong, right? So while the system is wrong, I'm okay. And so that's the moral and political turn, because we're recognizing that there's something wrong that has to change. But that doesn't have to be my burden as part of my identity. And that's kind of really, I think, really what helps, how yoga helps us move forward and heal.
Yeah. I I sometimes it's like yoga is going to save the world,
Well,
and
people have to do it.
and it's yeah, and it's sometimes it seems like, well, I mean, like depending on what your understanding of yoga is and all of that, that may seem a little bit rosy eyed and idealistic, but I think it is the absolute truth that the practice of it, in a multi-layered way,
Right.
is really the antidote for uh, uh, the suffering and the problems that the world's facing right here. And I love this idea of, that when you move past that ego, you move into personal relationships rather than that conflict of group versus group. And that's when you start to be able to make some progress. I think this is not going to happen quickly. I think this is a long term process that we're engaged in. I remember, last June of 2020 and all the protests that are happening, and thinking that, feeling, I don't know, uncomfortable for not being out there and involved in the protests, and then realizing that, well, I've got a different role, to play, and that there's a slow burn part of this that needs to happen as well.
For sure.
Yeah, that action may be necessary, but it's not something that we can sustain indefinitely.
Right. So burnout comes from being consequentialist. A consequentialist thing that you should do things for certain ends. And so people who get involved in causes on consequential, they'll burn out because you're not going to be able to accomplish that. Whatever noble end you want is not going to happen next week or the week after or the week after that. And if you think that, you putting in your 150% now is worth it because you're going to it's not going to happen. Right. And that's why in yoga, we don't think about outcomes. We just focus on the devotional practice because that's what's going to make the difference. Right. Because you're not going to bow out because you're burned out. You're going to keep at it. And the other thing that I think is really important is that we don't know how things can turn out, what opportunities present themselves until we start practicing, because otherwise all we have are just our experiences, and they were bad, right? So we have like visions of what the options are, right? But until we really start making a personal difference, like we don't know how things could be different. So sometimes just forgetting about those ends and just allowing yourself to really practice allows for like miracles, just all of a sudden new possibilities, new solutions, new ways of doing things, new knowledge, research, something that seemed unsolvable all of a sudden solvable, right? But you're not gonna appreciate that unless you're still in the game, and you're not gonna be there unless you've got the slow burn. It's a life practice. I'm not doing it for just this week.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thank you for reminding us about non-attachment to outcome and how freeing that is in this process as well.
Right.
And we're going to go ahead and we're going to officially bring it to a close. We're at time. Before we, I want to just give you opportunity, if anything feels like it remains that needs to be said. And then also I want to give you a chance to plug some of the courses that you have. And I highly recommend checking out your website. And I'm excited about the Yoga Origins course. So maybe you might even say a little bit about what that's going to involve.
Sure. So, Yoga Origins is a course I teach. I've taught it twice with Adusha Vijaykumar, who's also been on here. And so we'll do it sometime next year. But it's a 4-part course where we think about the issues of yoga in history and contrast it with people's expectations based on the Western tradition with respect to lineages and stuff like that. And so, it's I find it kind of liberating because it's nice to think about, to understand the original yoga as something for you to do. It's not about being part of some type of organization or tradition, but that's the way it's sold. And so anyways, appreciating its origins is, I find, very liberating to the practice. I also would, if anybody's wants to take their yoga philosophy education up a notch, I do have a 100-hour program. So I do recommend that for people who are, especially serious about learning. And there are 4 courses that are part of that. And we not only learn about yoga, but there's also one course where we look at moral philosophy from around the world. So you learn about the Western tradition, the Chinese, and the South Asian. And I think until you start to appreciate the options, there's so much of yoga that's not clear. So there's that. We also offer Sanskrit if you're interested, an introduction to Sanskrit. So there's a bunch of different things, but yeah, for sure. At yogaphilosophy.com, there's you can poke around and see what's of interest to you.
Yeah. Awesome. Wow. Yeah. And I forgot about the 100-hour yoga philosophy course. That is something I got to get some more space in my life, because I definitely want to dive into that, because this to me is just so engaging, so incredibly engaging. And you feel so fortunate to have met you. I didn't want to be around any people that night. I just wanted,
really?
I wanted to go to the bar, and I wanted to have a beer, and then I wanted to go to my room and go to bed, and I wanted to be alone. And then Claudia from Give Back Yoga was there and hailed me over. And then the discussion is just, I'm like, thank God I didn't do my usual self-isolating habit that night.
It's funny. I didn't even know about the bar. So somebody was like, "You want to go to the bar?" I'm like, "What?" So it was by chance that I showed up there. I think it was Catherine was like, "We've been going to the bar every night." I'm like, "What? There's a bar?" So, so a lot of things fell in place. I'm very glad to have met you and had that chat too. It's a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to having you back again sometime in the future. And and thanks for joining us this morning. And everybody, thank you. I know a lot of folks have to drop along the way, but for all of those remaining and everybody who was here and had to drop off, just really wonderful. I love you all, and I'm looking forward to the next time we get to be together.
Awesome. Me too. Thank you, everyone. Take care.